Okay, so we've gone over normal AEGs. If you have normal trigger contacts, you go watch the previous video. Now we're going to talk about something a little more complicated. If you have something like the VFC Avalon where it has an inline MOSFET, a lot of airsoft guns these days are coming with electronics like this. That's super cool, but it is slightly different than going to a normal pair of trigger contacts. So let's jump into it.
When looking at a basic MOSFET, like a lot of the ones you're going to see coming in stock guns these days, back in the day, these didn't come in stock guns. This used to be like the best electrical upgrade you can get. Now we have advanced ECUs. We'll stick to some basic MOSFETs for now. The main function of this MOSFET is to prevent electrical arcing on your trigger contacts. That way your trigger contacts don't fry out. It was a big problem for stock guns back in the day. These basic MOSFETs, while this one looks a little bit complicated, there are some very simple ones, and the premise is pretty much the same as far as how it's wired. You have a positive and negative that plugs directly to your battery, and then you have a positive negative coming out. The positive coming out is going into the motor. The negative coming out is going into the motor. The positive and signal coming out, these connect to your switch in two different locations on the switch. So generally the positive will connect to one of the contacts on your switch, and oftentimes you'll see that there's now two red wires coming out. Think of it as the same wire, but the switch is spliced in the middle of it. One's coming from the MOSFET and the other one's going into the motor. And then the signal wire is just going on the other contact on the switch. So when you are pulling your trigger, instead of making the two red wires touch to complete the circuit, you're actually now getting voltage in the signal wire, and the MOSFET is going to do all the magic work to make electrical arcs not happen. There's a way to wire this to your B.O.S. cable, and I'll start with the way we always start. We'll leave the B.O.S. cable out for now, and we'll get this wired up like it's just your gun, the way it comes. So positive and negative from the battery go to the MOSFET. All right, your negative is going to go to the negative terminal on your motor. The positive is going to go on one end of your switch, and from that switch goes on the positive terminal of your motor. And then the signal wire, and we're going to use a blue marker for this because we're just getting a lot of lines on this whiteboard now. The signal just goes on the other end of your switch. Now, when you have a circuit like this, and you have your B.O.S. cable, the SOP is first start with the positive and negative. Put the positive and negative somewhere where it's going to get constant power the moment the battery's plugged in. Looking at the wiring diagram provided by RDX in their manual, they're using a different MOSFET here, and their MOSFET does wire a little bit differently. This is a Jeftron MOSFET, an older one at that. But what we can take from this is that the positive and negative from the B.O.S. cable, it should go on this end of the MOSFET. The end of the MOSFET where the wires to the battery are. That way when you plug the battery in, you have these other positive and negative wires coming out, constantly giving power to the B.O.S. So as you can see, the positive wire here is all the way over here, connected to the battery, and the negative wire is all the way over here, connected to the battery. Now, like I was saying in the previous video, it does not matter where on that wire you put the B.O.S. wire. It just matters that it's on the correct wire. Now, if I were to put this positive and negative on the other end of the MOSFET, it might not work. And that makes sense, because when I plug a battery in, if you trace this positive and negative wire through the MOSFET, this positive wire is on the motor, and the negative wire is also on the motor. So something in the circuit of the MOSFET is preventing the motor from getting current directly from the battery. So if I were to take the positive and negative here and put it on this end of the MOSFET, when I plug the battery in, the B.O.S. unit wouldn't turn on. So again, it's very important. This is the SOP. Your positive and negative have to be somewhere in the circuit such that when you plug the battery in and you plug the B.O.S. unit in, you get the beep, 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 you know you're on. Once you do that, if you don't know exactly where to put your signal wire, let's say your MOSFET's a bit different than the one in the diagram that you're provided, a nice little trick is to take that signal wire and probe on different points on the circuit. Now, if I'm not hitting the switch or pulling the trigger, and I take the signal wire and I touch it somewhere, and just me touching the wire makes the B.O.S. unit go off, that's not what you want. Obviously, you want the B.O.S. unit to fire when you pull the trigger. So you want to find that place in the circuit where you can touch the signal wire to it, and the B.O.S. unit will only go off when you pull the trigger. In the case of a basic MOSFET, you just have to make that signal wire from the B.O.S. cable touch the point on the MOSFET or on the signal wire where the signal wire is connected. So in the case of this MOSFET I have here, which is different from the diagram, I would take the signal wire of the B.O.S. cable and I would solder it right onto there. Or I can solder it right onto here on the trigger contacts where the signal wire for the MOSFET is. Where you put it, it's going to be dependent on how you want to route those wires. When you're dealing with the MOSFET as opposed to basic contacts, you already automatically you're going to have more wires occupying the gearbox shell, and you probably don't want to add more wires than is necessary because it might make it difficult for you to close your shell. It might interfere with the motor as you insert the motor into the gearbox. This area right here is actually bridging underneath the motor tower, so you don't want to shred those wires up. So in this case, I can just take the signal wire from the B.O.S. cable, I can connect it to that switch, or I can take that cable, the signal wire from the B.O.S. cable, I can solder it directly to the MOSFET. Again, it doesn't matter where on this wire you solder the wire from the B.O.S. cable, it just matters that it's on the right wire. So now we're going to demonstrate that by actually soldering the B.O.S. cable onto this circuit. So here's that stock VFC MOSFET. Battery, MOSFET, motor, and switch. Just like in the whiteboard drawing. As you can see, it works. And it spins the motor. So now we're going to connect the B.O.S. cable. And it's going to be the same exact thing we've been showing. We're going to take the positive and negative, and we are going to put it somewhere on the circuit such that the moment the battery is plugged in, the B.O.S. unit gets constant power. In this case, I'm going to solder it directly onto the MOSFET right here. And again, this is not the way I would solder this if I was putting this in a build. This is just for demonstration purposes. So it's going to look a little bit crude, and I'm not going to be using any heat shrink. We're going to prep that area on the board for the positive and the negative. These wires were already tinned from the previous video, but I'm going to re-tin them just to show you that I suggest you re-tin these. Now, when soldering onto a board, you want to be very cautious about how long you're holding the iron to that. It's possible to get one point on the board so hot that it can actually melt some solder joints on other areas of the board. Some people say to use a 2-second rule, but if you break enough boards, you'll get a good feel for it. So we have the positive and negative soldered onto a positive and negative point, where when I connect the B.O.S. unit and plug the battery in, I'll get constant power. So I'm going to show that really quick. I also recommend you wear Ear Pro when testing this out. So now when I plug the battery in, the B.O.S. unit should turn on. There we go. So now, we already know that we would need to solder it to the signal wire. And if we do that, when the trigger is pulled, the B.O.S. unit will fire. But I want to kind of demonstrate probing really quick. So if I were to take the signal wire and I connect it to this positive wire, it will instantly fire even though I'm not pulling the trigger. So that's something to note. If you touch it on the negative wire, it's not going to do anything. Right now, I'm just going to hold it onto this point that the signal wire's on with my finger, and then I'm going to pull the trigger, and I'll show you what happens. As you can see, when I pulled the trigger, the B.O.S. unit fires. So that's telling me that this wire is where I want to solder the B.O.S. unit. So now, we talked about routing wires and how we don't want too many wires to be bridging this gap, right? Unfortunately, it is the case that if we were to put this in a gun, we'd have 4 wires bridging that gap. That could be a little bit messy. It might be something that you'd want to hold down in the shell with like hot glue, not super glue. Some shells have little pockets that you could tuck some wires into to help prevent the motor from damaging them. But the last thing I want to do is take the signal wire and just add a 3rd wire to that mix. So that's why it's really important to note, again, it does not matter where on the wire you connect this to, it just matters that it's on the right wire. So in probing, I was able to connect it directly to the trigger contacts, and it worked. So that's where I'm going to solder it. So I'm going to start by prepping this contact. Then I'm going to tin this wire. And now I can connect them. Again, very crude job. Not how I would solder it onto a customer gun. But now we have that circuit with the basic MOSFET. And let's just plug the motor in, plug the battery in, plug the B.O.S.S in, and do that hold check one more time. Always double check your work before closing your gun. That's plugged into the B.O.S.S. The B.O.S.S unit has constant power because we heard it beep. It's waiting for voltage from the signal wire, which we'll get when we pull the trigger. And when we talked about the basic circuit and the standard trigger contact, we talked about how on semi-auto, you actually have a mechanical lever that's going to release the trigger after one gearbox cycle, and this all happens very fast. So your semi-auto is going to happen as a result of this touching and then releasing pretty quickly, and because it gets disconnected, it doesn't send voltage through the signal wire, so the B.O.S.S unit stops. And on full auto, the cutoff lever does not disengage this, so you just hold it, and the B.O.S.S unit and the gun will fire until you release the trigger.